So, hello students, today we are here to talk about the fabric structure, and there is a little confusion between fabric and cloth maybe, but to be very clear, let us first understand what is the difference between fabric and cloth. Fabric is any textile structure made out of fibers or yarns or maybe non-fibrous substances also, whereas cloth is implied to that particular fabric where you talk about the end use of a fabric, like say for example a tablecloth, a bed sheet cloth. So, cloth is used in those terms of end use, whereas fabric is used in terms of a structure. Now, as I told you, fabric structure can be created either with the fibers or with the non-fibrous substances or with the yarns. So, among all these structures, we find that the structures which we make with the yarns are supposed to be little complex, and also it requires a lot of investment to make these structures out of yarns. So, there are many structures that can be made out of yarns, major being weaving, knitting, and from the fibers we have the non-woven structures, and from the non-fibrous substances we have the other types called as tufted fabrics, embroidered fabrics and all those things. So, among all these structures we find that knitting and weaving are supposed to be the best methods and most widely used methods, and in fact our apparel fabric, more than 50% of our apparel fabric or the fabric which we use for other than apparel purposes are also made out of weaving. And then comes the next second best method is the knitting, and we have non-wovens which are greatly used in the area where there we call it as technical textiles, that is for industrial purposes mostly, and for apparel purposes their usage is limited. Now, as we see the first part of weaving, because as I told you this is the most important and the fundamental method of fabric construction, we see that basically for weaving to take place we require a loom, and whereas for knitting or any other structures we require different types of materials that will go into the construction part. So, this loom is not a new invention. It was there since the prehistoric times, and also we find that there is no single time where we can say that this particular loom has evolved, because over a period of time and all over the world we see that at different parts of the world these looms were developing as per their usage, because each loom has some limitations, they have some disadvantages, some advantages. So, they started based on their end use, they started inventing more and more different types. And so, the meager evidence that we have from the prehistoric times or any other time does not give us a sufficient evidence that this particular loom is the first one and the second one is so forth and the third one is so forth. But to start with, any weaving to take place we should have a loom. And one more thing is, for a weaving to take place we should have two series of yarns. One is the warp yarn and the other is the weft yarn. So, as the warp yarn is held on the loom under tension, the weft yarn goes over and under this warp yarn, and in the second run it does the opposite of what it has done in the first run. That means, when in the first step when it has gone over the warp yarn, now in the second step it starts with under the warp yarn and then goes over. So, it is the reverse of what happens in the first, and the third will be similar to the first line, the fourth will be similar to the second line and so forth until the whole length of the fabric is completed in fact. So, here as the interlacement takes place only at 90 degrees angle, the loom has to be set up in such a condition that there is no deviation that happens in the 90-degree angle as well. And also when we see the first and the primary structures for weaving would be the plain, twill and the satin. These are the major three weaves which are supposed to be called as a simple weave structures, because they will be done with no attachment on the loom. A simple loom is enough for them to be performed. Based on these 3 weaves, the plain, twill and the satin, we have the other complex structures like brocades, damask, or maybe some figured weaves. So, all these can come, or it is applied on a fabric which the background is either a plain weave or a twill weave or a satin weave. So, we call those weaves as complex weaves in fact. So, when we come to the second basic weave, that is the twill weave, we can see that in the plain weave we require only 2 harnesses to perform the weaving action, but here the interlacement is different to that of a plain weave. So, here we require at least 3 harnesses, a minimum of 3 harnesses are required to perform a twill weave. In this weave, instead of going one above and one below of the warp yarn, the weft yarn travels more than one before it interlaces with the next yarn. That means, if 3 shafts are present, the weft yarn travels over 2 warp yarns first and then goes under the third one, again travels over 2 and under the third one. So, this happens throughout the length of the fabric, and in the second line, third line and so forth, the step or interlacement moves one step either to the right or one step either to the left, thereby creating a diagonal line effect on the fabric, which we call it as a veil. So, the characteristic feature of twill weave is having veils on the surface. Now, as we have seen the plain weave where it goes over and above one every time, the number of interlacements are more in the plain weave. Comparatively, the twill weave will have less number of interlacements, and thereby you are getting a sturdy fabric with the less number of interlacings, because the warp yarn is put together, it is slightly brought together because it is travelling over 2 and sometimes more than 2. As I told you, minimum is 3 and maximum can be anything for a twill weave. Now, coming to the third basic weave is the satin weave. It is also almost similar to the twill weave, where we have the diagonal effect, but purposefully in this weave the diagonal is cut down so that it does not resemble like a twill weave, and thereby, and moreover, the yarn that is used in satin weave is something like a filament yarn which has the lustrous look, and satin fabrics, the fabric itself is called by its name as satin. So, you must have seen the satin fabric which is very lustrous and mostly used for maybe sometimes for undergarments or evening wear and lining materials especially. So, that lustrous effect is created because it is cut down, the diagonal line is cut down, and the number of shafts that are required for an ordinary satin weave to take place is 5. So, 2 will be for plain weave, 3 will be for twill weave and 5 will be for satin weave. These are the minimum number, the maximum can be anything as per the design of the fabric. Now, when we see the type of fabrics that we get with all these 3 weaves, in plain weave we can get a fabric which is from a very lighter weight to a very thicker fabric, say a chunni material or a chiffon material which is light in weight, to even a bed sheet material which is very thick enough. That is possible in plain weave. So, because of the low number of interlacements in the twill weave, the yarns are together, and so we get fabrics which are sturdy enough, and so we get only the medium weight and the heavy weight fabrics. So, we do not get a lightweight fabric in this category, and in fact, because they are sturdy enough, most of the work clothes like your aprons, the jeans and all these materials, the work cloth materials are from twill weave only. And coming to the third basic weave, the satin weave, the fabrics which we get are also similar to the twill weave, where we get the medium weight and the heavy weight fabrics and not lightweight fabrics. Only plain weave is the only weave where we can get really very light sheer weight, we say, or the sheer fabrics are possible with the plain weave. So, they start from the ordinary chiffons to even the sheeting materials, as I have already discussed. There is one thing that is common with all these 3 weaves is you can make a fabric, a reversible fabric or an irreversible fabric. That means, when a plain weave is done, when you take an ordinary plain weave which is simply dyed in single color, you may not be able to find out which is the right side and which is the wrong side, unless you see the selvage or the finished edge where you see some holes because of the tendering purpose. So, that means those fabrics are supposed to be called as reversible fabrics. That means unless they are printed or embroidered or done something else, you will not make out what is a fabric. So, you can use the fabric on both the sides, either wrong side or the right side, because it does not have a right side and a wrong side. Coming to twill weave, we do have a reversible, because whatever you see on the face of the fabric will be different on the back side of the fabric. And for satin, the names are different. The face of the fabric, when we see the warp, we call it as satin, and when we see the weft, it is called as sateen. These are also not a reversible fabrics. And when we see all these three weaves, there is one more thing in common, where especially in case of twill weave, you can make a structure where you can make the warp yarn see more on the surface or face of the fabric, or weft yarn to be seen on the face of the fabric or on the surface of the fabric. So, in such case, we say warp faced and weft faced, if one percentage is more than the other. In case both warp and weft are equally visible on the face of the fabric, then we call them as even sided fabrics. So, as we know, the fabrics in apparel are the greatest from woven textiles, because they are available in different weights and they are used for many purposes. The only problem with the woven structures is that they do not have good stretchability, but the strength is good enough compared to other structures. So, wherever you want a sturdy fabrics, you can go in for the woven structures, and wherever you want certain light structures and stretchy ones, you can go using a knitted fabric in fact. Now, there are some true characteristics that we need to understand about these woven fabrics. The first one is the yarns that are used, because these yarns are two different types, warp and weft. Warp yarns are always thinner yarns, they are stronger yarns compared to the weft yarns, and they have to be in fact to undergo the stress of the weaving. And coming to the filling yarns, any fancy yarn, any low twist yarn can be used as a filling yarn, because it is not under tension at any point of time. So, the characteristic of yarn also will tell about the fabric. Suppose the whole warp yarn is only a thinner yarn and weft yarn is used some fancy yarn, say some slub yarn or bowkel yarn or whatever, then what happens, the structure which we get will be completely different to look at than the other one, and in fact textures are created by introducing different types of yarns in the weft direction. And the other characteristic which we need to understand is the count of the fabric. The fabric count, we say, it is the number of warp yarns and weft yarns that are present for 1 inch of fabric. That is how we estimate the fabric count. So, if the number of warp yarns are 60 and number of weft yarns are 64, then we say 60 into 64, saying that the warp yarn is first depicted, then the weft yarn is next depicted. And there are certain people who can also say that instead of saying 60 into 64, they say it as 124 also. So, it is a product, it is not multiplication, but it is a product there. So, this will help us to understand what is the structure that is being done. If it is 80 and 120, you can understand there is a lot of difference. If it is 60 and 60, you can say that they are almost equal. This also tells us about the balance. Warp yarn and weft yarn has to be balanced in a woven structure, otherwise there may be yarn slippage, there may be some other defects that would happen, and sometimes it becomes very difficult to sew the fabric into a garment as well. So, balance is another term which we should understand, that how many number of weft yarns are there and how many number of warp yarns are there, and whether there is a real good balance or not. A good balanced fabric will tell us again about the strength of the fabric. If there is imbalance, then the strength is lost, and sometimes that does not mean that 60 into 64 is a very good balance. In balance wise it is good enough, but sometimes if that 64 weft yarns are not given any twist, very low twist is given, and when it is introduced into the fabric, then we can say that though the fabric contains 60 into 64, still the fabric do not have good strength, because the yarn that is used is going to deteriorate the structure or the strength of that particular fabric. So, in such cases one should take care what is the yarn type that is used. So, by this we can understand that the yarn type that is used in a structure also will define its end use and its quality as well. The next characteristic which we find is the selvage. The selvage is one important aspect in a fabric, because when the weft yarn is running over the warp yarns, when it reaches one end, and then it is a continuous thread which goes from the second end to the first end, again from the first to the second end. So, in this process the edges which are parallel to the warp yarns will definitely have a thicker end, and it is a finished end. When you cut a fabric, you can see that there are some threads that are visible on the cut edge, but on the selvages where it is thicker than the rest of the fabric, you can see that there are no cut edges at all. So, it is a finished edge. And even the selvages are also different types, where we call it as a plain selvage, when the fabric and the selvage do have, or they are similar to look at, though the yarns are closer in the selvage, but the similar weave is done there as well. Then we call it as a plain selvage. And the other selvage is called the thicker selvage, where especially for sheetings we get, they do sometimes a basket weave, which is a variation of plain weave. More thicker threads are used in this particular thing. So, we have another one, and the third one also we have called a fused selvage, which is mostly used in thermoplastic fabrics. So, when thermoplastic fibers are used, thermoplastic is understandable that the fibers melt when little heat is applied. So, in such cases what they do is, after, and moreover the loom that is used for these fabrics is shuttleless looms, we say. That means there is no shuttle. So, the weft is carried by other means other than a shuttle. So, in such cases you have both the ends, a cut edges, which are fused, so that because they are thermoplastic in nature, these fusing will help to hold the yarns without raveling. So, we have that, and there is another one called the split selvage. Narrow fabrics are open. Instead of setting up the loom for a narrow fabric many times, they set a loom in such a way that 2 or 3 narrow fabrics can be woven at a time with a little gap between each set. So, when this is cut down, naturally we have a cut selvage which is finished off by different means, like they tuck it in sometimes, they use another type of a weave called as Leno weave, where it holds in the form of figure 8. So, that the selvages are very tight in fact, and the raveling is stopped altogether. So, these are some of the characteristics which we have to observe when we are purchasing a fabric, whether the quality of the fabric is good enough or the quality is very inferior. So, because we whatever we pay for is priced according to the quality of that particular fabric. So, these are some of the things which we need to understand about the fabric structure pertaining to weaving, because weaving is the basic structure. So, you know the uses of this structure is quite lot many, maybe from a small child to even an older person, all the fabrics are used. The curtains which we see around us, the upholstery materials, everything can be made out of even a woven structure. And moreover, these woven structures are something which have a lot of strength, and in industrial purposes, by changing the yarns in them, they are used for industrial purposes, like a tarpaulin. There is a fiber which is also done with a plain weave as well. So, it can be a twill weave, it can be a satin weave also. So, from apparel fabrics to the industrial fabrics or the technical sector, these fabrics are being used. And one more thing is, in wash and care, these particular fabrics do have a lot of strength, and they can withstand a lot many washes, unlike the other fabrics. But the problem is that they shrink, and the porosity of the fabric will be different. Porosity means a fabric should allow us to breathe, because when it is next to the skin, we should feel the breathability, otherwise we feel very uncomfortable. So, again the breathability of the fabric will depend upon the yarn that is used, the structure that is used as well. But the stretchability of these yarns is very less. When we take the grain, I told you the grain is something which, when they are at right angles, we say it is a grain. Now, in the grain, either in the vertical manner, that is in the warp direction or in the weft direction, the fabric will never stretch. But the only stretch that happens is when the fabric is cut in the bias direction, that is 45-degree angle to the warp and weft, then the fabric stretches its maximum. So, wherever you want to finish certain garments with the bias strip, stretchability or curved edges and all, we have to use a bias fabric in fact.